And that jarring cacophony tells you you're back with the Power of Three podcast, and today we're returning to the world of the new adventures as we launch another mini run as we feature those original novels that were too broad and too deep for the television way back in the 1990s. I'm Kenny Smith, and today we're going to be travelling to an alien world as we look at St Anthony's Fire, which was the 31st New Adventures novel featuring the 7th Doctor Ace and Bernice Summerfield. It was published on the 20th of October 1994 with a cover by Paul Campbell. And TARDIS Fandom points out this was writer Mark Gatiss' second and final contribution to the Virgin New Adventures range. So, we've mentioned the cover, let's take a look at it. Well, we can see that there's some red skies in the background, we can see there's some trees around, and there's three lizard-like creatures who are looking like they've got military battle armour on, a bit like geckos but with long thin necks. In the background in the jungle, and I've just noticed this for the first time ever, you can see the TARDIS with its lights on, and we can see the lizard in the foreground, looking a bit like one of the visitors from V, I suppose, is holding up a black umbrella, and on it is a straw hat. And as we look in the background there, we can see that there's a little man who's been pinned to some sort of pole, being tied back, and he's being held over a fire like a giant marshmallow. It's the Doctor. What on earth could these aliens be doing to him? Well, there's only one way to find out. Let's have a look at the back cover. This may explain what's going on. No time. They have come. They have come at last. The Doctor and Bernice visit Patricia, a planet famous for its beautiful ring system. They soon discover that the rain-drenched jungles are in turmoil. A vicious genocidal war is raging between the lizard-like natives. The ground itself is racked by mysterious earthquakes, and an unknown force is moving inexorably forwards, devastating everything in its path. Ace wanted out. She's resting on a neighbouring world, but from the outer reaches of space, a far greater threat is approaching Patricia, and even Ace may find it impossible to escape. With time running out, the Doctor must save the people of Patricia from their own terrible legacy before the wrath of St Anthony's Fire is visited upon them all. Could that fire in the cover be St Anthony's Fire, or is it just some lizards trying to toast a Time Lord? Who knows? Anyway, let's pause briefly and hear the Doctor Who magazine Prelude. This was written by Mark Gatiss and is read for us today by Stephen Day. Over to you, Stevie.
Somewhere mammals were howling. Their throaty cries carried up the dust-dry summer streets of Jarella, like banshee wails echoing off the walls of the great temple and the surrounding streets. Light glittered off every surface, rippling the air into hot waves. Portron Grek lay on his bed, scratching his snout, stubbornly refusing to have anything to do with the rest of the day. Bored and restless, he had spent the morning polishing the scales of his crest and removing specks of dust from his uniform. Around noon, with yet again no orders to advance, he had stripped off and lain on his bed in the barracks, his warty green skin hide bathed in sweat. If only something would happen. There had been times like this before, of course, times of endless nervous waiting in the trenches of the West. He had spent his first hours as an IMS-Tech officer continually vomiting, so profound was his fear of action. Greg smiled now as sunlight poured dustily through the blinds of the barrack room window. He could never have imagined he'd eventually become so blasé about it all. As Greg turned on his side, the door opened, and Makonza shuffled inside. Older than Greg, there was a suggestion of weariness in his gait and the curve of his shoulders. Few had served so long and so well. "Anything?" muttered Greg without opening his bulbous blue eyes. Makonza pulled off his tunic and sighed. "Not a thing. Intelligence reports the Kutch heading for the jungles upriver. But there hasn't been a single sighting. It's driving me mad." Greg could feel himself drifting into sleep. He opened his snout. The inside of his mouth felt thick and dry. "Where's Ron?" he croaked. Makonza had dug out a basin of water and was splashing his hot hide. Gone to temple, would you believe? Greg smiled. He always gets religious before a battle. Agreed Maconza. Trouble is, this one's been postponed so much he goes to temple every day. The elders thinks he wants to sign up. Greg laughed in a high staccato. Maconza opened the blind and squinted at the blast of light. He ran his long black tongue absently over the wet orbs of his eyes. With a crack like gunfire, the door burst open, and the young officer Ran almost fell into the room. "Sir! Sir! Sir!" he babbled, looking excitedly from Greg to Maconza. "All right, Ran. Keep calm. What is it?" Ran's face was suffused with excitement. "It's on, sir! It's on! The catch had been seen!" Greg sat up and swung his legs over the edge of the bed. "Where?" "Del Rudia Bridge, Patron!" gasped Ran, wiping the glutinous white sweat from his crested head. "Del Rudia Bridge," murmured Maconza. "That's in the dip of the valley, you know." "Yes, yes," said Greg excitedly, pulling on his tunic. "If we can trap them in the valley and cut off their retreat, then we've got them." The three Imstex officers beamed delightedly and hurried from the room. Greg flung himself to the ground as a Kutch bullet whistled over his head. Maconza and Ran were crouched low in the hollow roots of one of the great trees which covered the jungle perimeter. Both were breathing heavily, tense with adrenaline rush. "All right," said Greg quietly. "We know where they are. Tobus has got the other end sealed off. We've got to get them out in the open." He looked about in the gloomy undergrowth, just about able to make out the rest of the concealed squadron, their rifles poking through clusters of heavy, wet vegetation. Maconza peered into the jungle towards the old stones of Del Rudia Bridge. The water over which it had been built had long since vanished. "We need a diversion, something to bring them out, if they're as jumpy as us." Greg's scalp contracted in affirmation. "Yes, yeah, they'll go for the first thing that moves." He looked again at the rifle barrels, all pointed towards where the Kutch had holed themselves up. They had almost opened fire on their own relief column. Such was the tension. Insects chirped incessantly over the oppressed silence. Ran glanced over at his senior officers, sat up on his haunches, and then pelted across the jungle, waving his arms and screaming at the top of his voice. Greg lurched forward to stop him. "Run, you!" At once, the Kutch rifles exploded into activity. Greg's squadron responded in kind, blasting through the undergrowth with furious precision. Ran threw himself to the ground, rolled over, and hid behind a tree. Maconza whipped out his own rifle and bellowed, "Here they come!" The Kutch suddenly tore out from behind the bridge, their reptilian faces obscured by the smoke of their guns. "Fire! Fire!" screeched Greg. The Imstex squadron emerged from hiding and ruthlessly mowed the enemy down. Trapped in the narrow basin of the valley, the Kutch force soon succumbed to the superior Imstex squadrons. In only a few moments, the jungle floor was littered with the dead. Once he was sure the field of battle was clear, Greg sprinted towards Ran and hauled him from hiding by the scruff of his neck. He slapped the young officer about the face. "You idiot! Did I tell you to do that? Did I?" Ran made a feeble effort to cover his face. No, sir. No, sir." Suddenly Greg burst out laughing. "Good lad. Well done. You got initiative." He slapped the bemused Ran in the back and propelled him towards Maconza. "What do you say, Maconza? We'll make a poor tone of this one yet." The future was to prove Greg right, but he was not then to know how far his own destiny was linked to that of certain visitors countless eons away from the humble planet of Bedrusia.
Thanks again, Stevie. So what else can we tell you about this book? Well, actually, it was given an audiobook release. This was back in December 2017, when the Royal National Institute for the Blind in the UK adapted it. This was read by John Sackville, and it's available to those who are visually impaired. we've actually got an excerpt from it here, and you can just hear a little bit of that as the Doctor encounters Benny in the console room.
Bernice paused for a moment outside the plain white door and sucked her lower lip thoughtfully. Raising a hand to knock, she thought better of it and continued down the almost featureless corridor towards the console room. Even before she reached it, Bernice was aware that something was different. The threshold of the door was wreathed in shadow, blurring the corridor roundels as though night were encroaching into their very structure. The reassuring background hum, always present in the huge chamber, was unaccountably low, scarcely impinging on her senses. As she slipped through the doorway, she was shocked to discover the room in complete darkness. The air was cold to the point of frostiness, and she half expected to find a carpet of mist creeping around her ankles. There was no light coming from the console itself, but she could make out the rising and falling of the time rotor, its glass column whispering up and down like the shallow breathing of a dying man. Bernice felt her way inside. When she was sure of the roundels behind her back, she took a deep breath, which rasped painfully in her lungs. "Doctor?" There was no response. Only the steady rhythm of the console. She could make out shapes, looming hugely out of the darkness, but whether they were items of furniture or unknown hostiles she couldn't tell. Then, almost imperceptibly, a panel of dials and switches on one side of the console glowed into life. The pale, ghostly light illuminated a hand and a suggestion of cuff. "Doctor?" Bernice called again, a little louder. "Hush! What's going on? Hush!" The hand stretched out, beating a tattoo on the console. At once, a second panel flared into brightness. Bernice could make out most of the crumpled three-piece linen suit which the Doctor had recently adopted, but his face was still hidden. "Now," whispered the Doctor, his breath like a pistol shot in the icy air. "The moment of truth." There was a brief, frantic flurry of movement as the Doctor's hands danced over the console. As Bernice watched, the room was drenched in light. The temperature rose, and the background hum reached its familiar pitch once more. She felt immensely comforted. The Doctor stepped back from the console like an exhausted conductor and beamed delightedly. "Well, that's that. 3 cheers and pats on backs all round, I think." He was a small man of indeterminate age, his brown hair rather long, his bushy brows and stern expression enlivened by a twinkling gaze. Bernice noticed that his neck was almost swallowed up by a black cravat and stiff Gladstone collar, the ends of which bent down whenever he smiled. "What have you done?" said Bernice, crossing to the console and looking down worriedly as though expecting some drastic alteration. "Just solved a little problem," smiled the Doctor, stuffing his hands into his trouser pockets. "A little problem of chameleonic fluctuation." He rolled his eyes like a Victorian sideshow owner. "Chameleonic what?" "It's a problem inherent in the long-term maintenance of one particular program on the exterior continua." "Sorry I asked." No, it's quite simple." The Doctor took one hand out of his pocket and tapped the console affectionately. A flat tablet had risen from the console, and the Doctor prodded the screen, scrolling down a detailed depiction of the TARDIS exterior. "Police box, you see? Earth, mid-20th century. You know the drill," he continued, waving his hands effusively. "Anyway, after all these years in roughly the same form, the program deteriorates a little." Bernice fixed him with a worried frown. "Deteriorates? Things tend to drop off." Bernice raised an eyebrow. The Doctor harumphed. "Well, not so much drop off as disappear. Here today, gone yesterday, as it were." "And that's chameleonic fluctuation?" The Doctor nodded vigorously. "Lost the whole stacked roof once. Took ages to come back. And there was a sort of badge on the door panel. If all's well, there should be again. Shall we go out and see?" Bernice held up her hands. "Hang on, Doctor. Before we examine the paint job, I thought we might take a little trip." "Why not?" drawled the Doctor. "Where would you like to go?" He began to fuss around the console, reeling off sites of universal interest which Bernice could scarcely make out, let alone understand. She put a hand on his shoulder in an effort to stop the flow, but he seemed to look through her towards the interior door. "Of course, we'd better consult Ace," he said. "She'll only get sulky if we plan something without her." The Doctor moved off.
If you want to donate to the RNIB, you can go to www.rnib.org.uk, and they do amazing work. I have friends who benefited from this, including my own mum, and she was very much helped out by the audiobooks that were sent out to help her, and they're a great charity. Please do support them if you can, as every day 250 people start to lose their sight in the UK, and if you make a donation you can help them through their ECLOs, their Eye Care Liaison Officers, who provide immediate vital assistance in eye clinics, and they have a helpline as well, so that will assist people when they need it most when it comes to losing their vision. So please do consider making a donation to them. Now, this is an unusual book because when I was thinking about it before I started rereading it, I was thinking, what do I know about it? I remembered there were lizards in it. I remembered that there was, obviously the cover image is quite a strong one, and pretty much beyond that, not very much, which is unusual because I'm normally very good in this sort of detail. I suppose this is quite an unusual book for Mark Gatiss, given that you normally associate him with gothic horror and things like that, adventures on Earth. I mean, you look at his television stories, they've all got a clear image. Gas monsters with the Gelth in The Unquiet Dead, people losing their faces which are sucked off by the television, Matron. You move on to his other ones, you think what he did under Stephen Moffat. You think of Victory of the Daleks, and you've got that wonderful imagery of those wonderful Daleks and their war fatigues. I do quite like them, I must admit, those lovely Ironsides. Then you move on, you think of what else Mark did. You think of the Crimson Horror. There's that lovely Victorian element there, and of course, everything that Mark did, of course, with Capaldi's Doctor as well. Although, you think of Sleep No More, and again, there are horror elements there. So yes, this is very unusual, given that it's all out space adventure, so not quite his usual wheelhouse. But what does Mark think about the book? Well, I did message him, and unfortunately he is super busy at the moment, and he wasn't able to take part. But we do have the power of archive interviews, and Mark has been interviewed previously in Doctor Who magazine, and we're now going to find out a little bit more about what Mark had to say in there. Let's kick off with an interview that first appeared in the feature Writing New Who by Craig Hinton, and this appeared in Doctor Who magazine issue 222. And this is read for us by Martin Montague.
Mark Gatiss's treatise on nostalgia, the 1992 New Adventure Nightshade, was followed up by his decidedly anti-religious St. Anthony's Fire, his mark against religion.
I respect religion. I don't attack people for their beliefs, although I don't have one of my own. I'm an atheist. But I'm very much against organised religion. It's the source of most of the world's worries, and the hypocrisy of some faiths makes me very angry. After Nightshade, I was casting about for ideas and submitted 2 outlines to Virgin. Both were rejected, the first one deservedly so. The second, Maniac's Tear, was a Jack the Ripper story, but that was turned down because the storyline coincided with Nigel Robinson's Birthright. And then after those 2, it came to me in a vision. A planet with a ring system, but the rings were artificial. After the Earthbound Nightshade, I thought I'd better try something a bit spacey, but I was very conscious of making the Petrusians anthropomorphic, a la Doctor Who. I love the First World War, although I wouldn't want to be in it, and I fought back when Virgin wanted me to have the war fought with lasers. I wanted machine guns, I wanted that crudeness. I also wanted a total change of pace towards the end of the book, like the War Games, where there are 7 episodes of grim and grittiness, followed by 3 episodes of campness. So I went from the grim warfare on Petrusia to some of the campest performances ever seen in a Doctor Who book. When I wrote the head of the chapter of St. Anthony, I had a Bond villain in mind.
Was Mark pleased by the end result?
Yes, but I preferred the original conclusion. I contrasted the high camp of the last few chapters with a really downbeat ending. The Doctor realised that after the organism had originally spent itself, it became part of the planet, including the Petrusians. So, to prevent it from escaping, they had to sacrifice themselves. But I'm content with the happy ending as published. The writing of St. Anthony's Fire and Nightshade were very different. St. Anthony's Fire was the second one, and it didn't have the same sense of excitement. It was more of a job. That's not to say I didn't enjoy writing it. I had a lot of fun with it, and I felt it was a lot lighter. I put everything into Nightshade because I really wanted to prove myself, but I thought I'd come on a lot as a working writer with St. Anthony's Fire. I especially enjoyed writing the sections about the chapter of St. Anthony, and found myself looking forward to them cropping up, gave me a chance to camp the book up a bit. They really were a labour of love. The hardest part was the characterisation of the Petrusians, because they were aliens. I much prefer creating characters that can do things I can do. I found setting up a social system for aliens very difficult, because if you do things totally differently, you run the risk of losing your audience. You have to strike a happy medium. I've never wanted to broaden or expand Doctor Who artificially. The value of the new and missing adventures is that you can have fun taking the traditional Doctor Who concepts and then use the prose to go into far greater depth with the characters and plot. Some of the books aren't really Doctor Who at all, because the authors have tried to do something so different. Nightshade was the Doctor Who book I've always wanted to write.
As the years went by, of course, Mark became very famous on British television, and indeed film these days, having appeared at the start of the Fantastic Four movie, playing a Ed Sullivan type character hosting his own chat show. So, when Mark was interviewed by Doctor Who magazine again in issue 332, it was not too long after the broadcast of BBC Two's Doctor Who Night, where Mark, who had found fame as part of the League of Gentlemen, featured on television quite a lot, and he was interviewed again by DWM about his career. And of course, bear in mind, this is long before the TV show came back. So, we're now going to hear a second excerpt from Mark, and this is from his interview in Doctor Who magazine issue 332, where he looks back and discusses St. Anthony's Fire.
Moving on a bit now, aren't we? And the second coming wasn't quite as successful as I recall.
Well, it wasn't a disaster or anything, but I'm not happy with it. There are two things wrong, really. Firstly, I know I'm happier writing about Earth, and the space opera bit I couldn't really get that into. I think I would have been happier if it had been a colony of some kind, where you could identify with the human types. But I think I went too far with the aliens and all that. But the biggest problem for me was that it wasn't supposed to be like that.
No? So what went wrong?
It was written so that the first third of the book is entirely about the aliens, and then at one point the leader of one of the groups goes down into the cellar where they've captured an animal, and he looks at this strange creature in its tattered white skins and its ugly ape-like face, and the last line was, "All in all, the Doctor was not having a good day." And then he goes back and explains how the Doctor came to be there. And I don't know why, and I did try to fight it, but what Virgin asked me to do was pluck it apart and write it in chronological story order. I read somewhere someone describing it as a train wreck of a book. It's got some nice bits in it, but it's still very much my second idea book. I just don't think there was any heart in it, really.
But with a promised new career stretching ahead, does Mark not get even a teensy bit fed up with Doctor Who after St. Anthony's Fire had failed to set the world alight?
That is a really cuntish question, isn't it? Well, I'd certainly decided I wasn't going to get to the situation where I'd churn them out just to make money. I suppose it was just very quiet around then anyway. It was well before news of the TV movie. You know, it was just taking care of itself, and I was starting to get a few other things on the go. There was an expression that John Nathan Turner used to use about writers being hooed out, and I remember as a kid thinking, nonsense, I could write 1,000,000 stories. But in fact, it's dead true. I still find to this day that if I've just written one, it takes me about a year to do another. But then suddenly, when I'm sitting in the bath, I'll think, oh, that's a good idea.
And thanks again to Martin Montague for taking the time to read those for us. Hasn't he got a lovely, warm, friendly voice? Quite like Mark's, but obviously not with the same accent. We're now going to have a quick break again before we bring you the reviews from Doctor Who magazine at the time, and indeed what people think about the book today in 2026. So we're going to hear another reading. This is again courtesy of the audiobook from the RNIB. And again, please do consider donating to them if you enjoy it.
Dusky light bled slowly into the doctor's eyelids, revealing a letterbox view of the Petrusian jungle. His sight suddenly blurred sickeningly as he was swung back and forth by reptilian arms in black cloth uniforms. A pattern of jungle and mud swam before his eyes. He was being carried upside down. A sparkling golden light in the indigo sky seemed to be the first suggestion of the ring system creeping into luminescence. But the doctor was too aware of the terrible, dull pain in the back of his neck to care. Feeling his hair matting in the sticky black mud, the doctor closed his eyes and sighed. Captured. Again. He had some vague memory of reaching the TARDIS, finding Bernice gone, turning back to see where she'd got to, and then something heavy had come down onto his head, and he had slid silently onto the marshy ground. How long he'd been unconscious he couldn't tell, but his wrists and shins had been expertly tied together, and a long wooden pole slid through his bonds. The smell of sap from the newly felled wood was overpowering. There was a large fire somewhere nearby which crackled and spat damply as the reptiles crowded around, warming their necks and upper bodies in a curiously cat-like fashion. The doctor opened his eyes fully, ignoring the pain in his head, and began to struggle against the ropes which bit into his flesh. Vainly, he tried to remember every muscle relaxation technique he had learned over the centuries, but his mind seemed fuzzy and unfocused. He clamped his eyes shut as he felt himself being hoisted in the air and carried towards the fire. The downy hairs on his cheeks seemed to retreat into his skin as though afraid of the flames. There was a lurching movement, and he was dumped onto the ground once more, mud splashing into his face. There were soft footsteps in the undergrowth as someone else approached. The atmosphere changed palpably as the two reptiles standing over him stiffened to attention. Their boots creaked by the doctor's prone face. He looked up cautiously. A creature with one eye and wearing a pristine black uniform had approached, his claws behind his back. The other soldiers fell silent. He leant down to examine the TARDIS, his scaly face crinkling in puzzlement. He passed his claw over the freshly restored St. John's Ambulance badge, and then straightened up. The doctor could see the alien looking curiously at him, but was too woozy to make any sense of the situation. The reptile picked up the doctor's hat with the doctor's umbrella and peered at both unfamiliar items. Then he dropped them with a shrug, gave a little jerk of his head, and walked off into the jungle. The soldiers relaxed. The doctor found himself being lifted again, and this time the flames danced closer before his eyes. The image of the TARDIS swooped before him, shimmering in the haze from the fire. He seemed to be swooning in and out of consciousness. The darkness of the jungle, the heat of the flames, and the animal stench of his captors assaulting his befuddled senses. He struggled weakly with his bonds and felt them biting agonizingly into his exposed wrists. The heat increased steadily. The hem of the doctor's coat flapped into the flames as the two soldiers hoisted him onto a spit. He screwed his eyes tightly shut and struggled feverishly with the coarse twine which bound him. If he could only shout out, convince these creatures he was more than just a dumb animal. But his voice seemed to die in his throat, as waves of heat pounded at his skin. His eyes stung with sweat, and hot rising air burnt the insides of his nose and throat. It felt like he was breathing fire. Panting desperately, the doctor made one last effort to pull himself away, and then the night closed in around him.
So there you go, now you know a little bit more about the cover. Let's turn to the pages of Doctor Who magazine and see what they had to say about it in Shelf Life. Craig Hinton's in the reviewing chair and he says, "On the planet Patricia, 15 years of bloody and genocidal civil war are coming to an end. Or are they? While the opposing forces of the Kutch and the Ismech are laying down their arms, other protagonists are entering the fray, wielding powers far beyond the Patricians' comprehension. Is it the coming of the mythical Keth, or something even worse?" Meanwhile, Ace is in a funny mood. Seeing that she needs time to think, the Doctor and Benny leave her on the idyllic planet Massatorus, before setting off to do a bit of sightseeing on the ringed world of Patricia. Inevitably, they are captured, Benny by the Kutch and the Doctor by the Ismech, who have a very nasty fate in store for him. Just look at Paul Campbell's vivacious cover to see what it is. But all this pales into insignificance compared with the nemesis which are converging on Patricia. An aeons-old horror emerges from beneath the ground. An equally deadly enemy hangs in space. An enemy that brings the salvation of St. Anthony's Fire. After Mark Gatiss's treatise on nostalgia, The Excellent Nightshade, I had high hopes for his second new adventure, St. Anthony's Fire. ISBN 0426 204239. The characterisation is outstanding. The regulars are all in fine fettle, and Mark has a handle on Benny that should be the benchmark for writing her. The patricians that we meet are equally well defined. Embittered army officers, eager young soldiers, devoted holy men. But they are all representations of an alien culture that is nothing more than 20th century humanity given scales and claws. The problem is, having just been immersed in the truly alien world of the Venusians, he also reviewed Venusian Lullaby this issue, I've been spoilt. I know how difficult it is to create a really alien race, but Mark doesn't really seem to have tried with the patricians. Then again, the really interesting characters are all in the human Church of St. Anthony. Imagine a warped form of Catholicism that believes that true salvation comes from pain and suffering, cardinals who impale kittens through the throat for pleasure before eating babies, and bishops who seek sexual gratification from their acolytes. Mark has assembled a troupe of distasteful grotesques that are a perverse joy to behold, even if their collected psychological problems would keep Freud and Jung busy for centuries. There are no real problems with the dramatis personae, and the writing cannot be faulted, as Mark has a compelling and witty prose style that holds its own against the Cornells, Lanes, Ormonds et al. No, the real problem with St. Anthony's Fire is the plot. It is so boring. I can see why this book looked good in outline. An alien race with deep religious beliefs, confronted by their own personal devils and pseudo-Catholic warriors, whose idea of converting a civilization is to destroy it. But the separate parts of the plot don't really relate to each other. Plot 1, the patricians fight for peace. Plot 2, the followers of St. Anthony are on their way. Plot 3, the legacy of Patricia awakens. All three themes are excellently thought out, but only the flimsiest of threads connect them, and these connections just don't stand up under examination. My attention flagged a third of the way through the book, and I had great difficulty sustaining my interest from then on. Not a good sign. St. Anthony's Fire is chock-a-block full of brilliant and original concepts. It bursts with well-rounded characters. It's compellingly written. It's just dull, I'm afraid. Pros: the characters. Ace's fate. Cons: dull plot. Redesigning the TARDIS. Why? The climax. Verdict: 2 stars. So, bit of a mixed bag there from Craig. Let's get another quick review from iWho, the unauthorised guide to Doctor Who novels, for a slightly more contemporary review, see what their thinking was. At the end of the day, an unabashed train wreck, St. Anthony's Fire wants to simultaneously juggle racism, religion and war, but doesn't have the conviction or mettle for any of them. As religious fanatics, the blatant chapter of St Anthony, whose members decapitate kittens and want to kill their parents, lack any subtlety. A giant yellow ooze creature gets thrown in for good measure, and the underscored hypocrisy of Benny, who destroys the St Anthony mothership without telling the Doctor, sadly isn't referred to again. A true disappointment from Mark Gatiss after the skillful Nightshade. Oh dear. In trying to give this a little more context, the DWM poll in issue 265, which gave readers the chance to vote for all of the new adventures, saw this one finish 47th out of 61. So it's behind Cat's Cradle Warhead and Cat's Cradle Witchmark, and it's just ahead of Time Worm Genesis and Strange England. For context, Nightshade finished 4th in the overall poll. So let's pop over to Goodreads to see what you, the readers, think today in 2026. It's got a rating of 3.24 from 190 ratings and 23 reviews. 5-star reviews are 13%, 4-star reviews 19%, 3 stars 45%, 2 stars 19%, 1 star 1%. Let's start with Paul Flint. Paul says, I really enjoyed this book, the second one Mark Gatiss wrote for the New Adventures. I reread it recently. The alien world is visually well realised, and the reptile warring factions are interesting. The plot kept me turning the pages. I liked the religious elements in this, as it added depth to the novel. I would highly recommend this to all Who fans. 10 out of 10. Nice stuff, Paul. Glad you enjoyed it. Next up is Keoru, who gave the book 4 stars. What do they have to say about it? Well, who could be the most suitable to write the book that sits exactly in the middle of the New Adventures series? Well, Mark Gatiss, of course, the most average Doctor Who writer of them all. And, as with all things Gatiss, St Anthony's Fire is impossibly derivative, and you have to examine it with a magnifying glass to find a single original idea. But hey, what can I say? It works, and for a Gatiss story, it's surprisingly gripping. It's a fast-paced read, and I almost finished it in one sitting. Besides, it has an abundance of Space Lizard characters, and who doesn't like them? Space Lizard characters are what SF is all about, baby! Next is the 3-star review from James Barnard. James says, There are 2 ways to follow up an acclaimed debut novel, all of which bring pitfalls to the author. You can choose a style and setting that reflects the first book, and run the risk of being seen to offer nothing more than reheated leftovers. Or you can choose a style and setting that's so radically different from the first that people may not believe it's a work from the same author, but then run the risk of alienating people who expected something different. Mark Gatiss, in his follow-up to the well-loved Nightshade, well and truly avoided the first pitfall, but fell headfirst into the latter. To clarify, this is nowhere near as disappointing as its reputation might suggest. What's clear to me is this. The second time I read it, is that Gatiss doesn't want us to take it too seriously. It's rather easier to see now, with the benefit of Gatiss's brand of dark humour through his work with the League of Gentlemen, that this is where it's pitched. But we didn't know that in 1994. And without that knowledge, it may look as if this is an uneven mess, rather than a knowing wink to an audience. There's a decent central idea at this novel's heart, which sees a civil war between different factions of a reptilian race, whose disagreements around religious doctrine pale into insignificance when a humanoid race move in for the kill. Yes, here the Doctor and companions are on the side of the aliens, in the face of an onslaught from a human monster. And just in case we don't realise these humanoids are thoroughly nasty, we're treated to a scene in which one of them murders an innocent kitten. This is a scene resolutely intended to shock its audience. 20 years on, thanks to the aforementioned League of Gentlemen, this development wasn't entirely unexpected, since it's the sort of thing that happened all the time in Royst and Vasey. I must admit, I had forgotten it from my first reading, but I don't think it's because I was so traumatised that I blanked it from my memory. It's an interesting move to subvert the usual expectations around humans versus monsters, and the scenes towards the end of the book, where the 2 reptilian factions unite to defeat a common foe, are among its best. Less successful is the build-up to this point, where there's a hell of a lot of exposition about why the 2 factions hate each other so much, and a coup seems to be brewing in one camp. There's a term for this sort of thing in Doctor Who, squabbling rubber, and it's apt. It's hard for an audience to care very much about the arguments between one or two actors in a mask on television, and if nothing else, this proves that the same is true in book form. Ah well, we're all entitled to a misfire. This, I can confidently say, is the weakest link in the chain of Mark Gatiss's work. The fact that it's a pretty decent book, despite its faults, is testament to the supreme talent of the man. I liked the book the first time round, I liked it this time as well. I am glad Gatiss has decided to stick to more earthbound stories since St. Anthony's Fire, but at least he tried to do something a bit different with this one. Given this book seems to be getting a fair number of 3-star reviews, here's a couple of extra ones as well. Christopher M says, an odd novel with too much plot, the warring iguana armies who've both lost interest in fighting, if only they communicated, turn out to be pure padding, and too little characterisation. Oh, it's the one with the twitch, the one missing an eye, Acne Boy. There's some needless violence as we establish the baddie is bad because he kills a child and a kitten. Goodness knows where he even got a kitten, and the Doctor is written as Pertwee. But there is a clever bit with the amnesiac bald lady that only works because you can't see her in prose. 3 stars from Kat. I adore Gatiss, but his writing certainly does contain a lot of cheese. Scurra said, 3 stars feels a little harsh for what is a rather decent entry in the series, but whereas Terence Dix pulled off a story of 2 entirely disparate halves immaculately in Blood Harvest, Gatiss tries to make his 2 halves fit together, and they just don't. Laura said, I like the settling of the end of the Civil War, plus a fundamentalist cult, but the villain smacked way too much of Orientalism. Plus, there were a few bits that fell flat for me on top of that, like the fact that they just let the Doctor roam their ship freely at one point. I wasn't really convinced by the explanation for it. And finally another 3-star review from James Bowman, who says, some excellent world building and characterizations among the feared alien race, and an interesting threat to deal with. However, this also exemplifies some of the repeated flaws of the New Adventures line, mainly in the over-the-top edgy villains introduced midway through. If you can look past that though, this is a fairly solid 7th Doctor novel. Here's one from one of our regular reviewers who we read out. It's Daniel Kukwa. Daniel gave this one 2 stars. This is the only one of Mark Gatiss's Doctor Who novels I'd call a disappointment. While there is nothing intrinsically wrong with the story, it reads as if the author's heart simply wasn't in it. The beautiful characterisation of the 7th Doctor, evident in Gatiss's first novel Nightshade, is completely absent, and the rest of the characters seem to veer between underwhelming and depressing. Consider this an aberration, and enjoy the rest of Mr. Gatiss's back catalogue. And finally, a 1-star review from Chris. Another new to me VNA, and whilst I had heard this one wasn't great, I didn't quite expect it to be this bad. First of all, I think as a general rule, Doctor Who doesn't do well with religion satires or pirates. And, largely for the same reason, these are complicated and need to be addressed with care, whilst anyone that wants to write has no interest in this. Here, warped versions of religions just maim and kill in a genocidal war because evil. And it doesn't go anywhere, the end is just standard explosions. And, at the same time, it is so overfilled with florid prose, it feels like an 11-year-old's creative writing class, maybe in contention for the worst of the run. Oh crikey. That's not a win then from Chris with a K. Oh dear. If you've enjoyed today's episode, unlike Chris with this book, you can leave a comment for us on our Facebook page. Let us know what you think of the book. You can find our Facebook group on that social media site. We have Twitter as well, at Power of 3 Pod, and also we have a Blue Sky account as well, which is at Finished Zine. So now it's time to go, and we're going to finish up with a tune, as we like to do. And this is one from Electronic, that supergroup featuring Bernard Sumner from New Order and Johnny Marr from the Smiths. And this one features a couple of guests. It's got Neil Tennant and Chris Lowe from Pet Shop Boys. This is Patience of a Saint. Until next time, I've been Kenny Smith. Bye bye.